So Senator Ortman, I'll welcome you up here. We're going to do 5 minutes of an intro, and then we're going to finish with three questions, 2 minutes each, and yes or no. Okay, welcome.
Hello. It's good to be back again. I've been a little under the weather this weekend, but I wanted to be here in Chanhassen. You all know that I live within a couple of miles of here. My son Sam is a sophomore at Chanhassen High School, and we've had 2 that have graduated from Chaska and 1 from Chanhassen. I used to think they built that extra high school just to separate numbers 2 and 3, but no, that's not why they built the high school. I'm happy to be here. I am running for the United States Senate, and it's up to you and I as the citizens of the state of Minnesota this year to remove Al Franken from office. And so I want to know, Minnesota, are we going to claim this seat back for Minnesota, or are we going to let Washington control this seat for another 6 years? Are we going to claim it back? I think it's imperative, and I need your partnership to do this. This is an enormous undertaking, but when I decided to run back in August of 2013, I really examined in my own mind, what could one person do to really turn things around in Washington? Because I have to ask you, is anybody proud of our federal government these days?
No.
Are you trusting our elected officials?
No.
Me neither. And I am really tired of seeing elected officials go to Washington never to turn back around to see what we need here in Minnesota. I'm really tired of elected officials that care more about what Washington wants and less about what Minnesota wants and what we need. I'm tired of having a U.S. Senator that has voted 100% of the time with President Obama. He doesn't care about Minnesotans' best interests, and that's why it's our job to step up and hire a replacement. And so I'm passing out my job application so you can all see it, because I understand that our next U.S. Senator has to work for us, for the ordinary people of the state of Minnesota, and not for the Washington special interests. That hasn't been working, has it? Hasn't been working. And so I don't want to concede that Washington is in control. I don't want to give up and say that we can't solve the greatest problems we face as a nation. We, the people, absolutely can solve the problems that we face as a nation. And the roadmap is the Constitution of the United States. And if our United States senators actually followed that Constitution as the roadmap, we would have all the solutions we need to address our great problems as a nation. The separation of powers is enormous. The powers of the U.S. Senate, unique unto itself, confirmation, that's not a power of the U.S. House. The power of ratification of treaties, insisting that any UN agenda item gets 2/3 of a vote, ratification in the U.S. Senate. They haven't insisted on that. There are powers unique to the U.S. Senate. Imagine if we had a U.S. Senate that took much more seriously that power of confirming our federal court judges. Maybe they'd ask a few questions about those FISA courts, do you think? Do you think maybe they'd ask about the NSA spying in the Judiciary Committee? If they were actually using the powers of the Constitution? That's what we need, is a U.S. Senator unafraid to use the powers of the Constitution to hold the executive branch accountable and to hold the judicial branch of our government accountable. And that's what it's going to take. And so when I asked myself, can one person really make a difference? I was reminded of a great story in our past that has inspired me throughout this campaign. One person, a 29-year-old young man, first elected to the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and in his very first year of service, he went into the House of Burgesses, waited nearly till the end of the legislative session that year in colonial Virginia, and he introduced the Stamp Act resolutions. And with a bare majority, he passed 5 Stamp Act resolutions after decrying on the House of Burgesses floor that the King of England had broken the compact with the subjects in colonial Virginia. And of course, he got all kinds of claims of treason, treason, treason. But he stood his ground. And the House of Burgesses barely voted with him, but they passed the Stamp Act resolutions. And then you want to know what happened the next day? The Speaker called back all the missing members from the House of Burgesses, and they took back the vote, and they erased the record to say that they'd never been passed. But Patrick Henry, the young man I'm talking about, the 29-year-old, on his way out of town, he had dropped the past resolutions into the post box for the Virginia Gazette. They published it in a circular series that went to Maryland, Massachusetts, and New York. And they called for a boycott on the Stamp Acts and all the products that were insisting to have the stamps on them. And then the merchants who weren't getting paid, the English merchants, called on Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, and they were repealed. And that's what provoked our revolution. One person, very determined, can make a difference. And I hope each and every one of you will stand up and be that person to make sure we win this election and we have an America we can be proud of and an America that is respected in the world again. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question tonight is, do you support abolishing the IRS and repealing the 16th Amendment? If so, do you advocate for the fair tax or the flat tax? And if not, what solutions would you propose to rein in the out-of-control taxation by the federal government?
Well, there are like at least 3 things that I think we need to do. Number 1, we need to flatten our taxes. We don't need the government picking winners and losers. We absolutely need to have a flatter rate of taxation. Secondly, we don't need an IRS that is illegally targeting law-abiding American citizens when they file their tax returns. You all know what has happened. Here we are at the Tea Party. You know. I know many people in this room. I know many Minnesotans that were illegally targeted by our own government. And so there needs to be a stop to that. The best way I know to stop that is for the U.S. Senate to actually wield those constitutional powers again. No official from the IRS should ever be confirmed again until we get to the heart of that. No Department of Justice official or Attorney General should ever be confirmed again until we truly investigate what's been happening there. And then the third thing, why on earth does the IRS have its own enforcement powers, its own police powers? We need to strip all those agencies of their independent police powers, not just the IRS, but the Department of Education. Why do they need guns and bullets in the Department of Education? Why do they need a police department for the Bureau of Land Management? We need to rein in all those enforcement authorities in all of these agencies. And truly, we need to put a moratorium on all the rules and regulations so we can take time to repeal as many of them as possible. We need to stop the proliferation of rules and regulations that are choking our economy, and we need a stronger U.S. Senate that's prepared to do it. Most people forget that the powers of the agencies come from statutes passed by Congress. So when your congressman or woman says, well, I can't do anything about those agencies' overreach, well, of course they can. They can repeal the delegation of authority in the first place. They need to repeal those delegations of authorities, those statutes that give them powers, and repeal those rules and regulations and rewrite them so that we have a federal government we can be proud of. And I hope our Senate Republican caucus, if we take the majority in the U.S. Senate, will work to repeal them all and rework, eliminate all those rules and regulations, and start over with the authorities we grant to those agencies.
Thank you. And our second question, how should the United States maximize energy independence while reining in the EPA and its burdensome regulations which violate private property rights and stifle business growth?
Thank you. Well, I think we have to admit that the Obama administration has failed in foreign policy. Now, it sounds like I might not be answering the question, but energy policy is so unnecessarily entangled with our foreign policy. And so we need to have as a goal to disentangle our energy policy from our foreign policy. We have an administration that is doing business with dictators. They're beholden to dangerous nations for the reliance on oil and energy. When we have the solutions right here in the United States, we need to permit the Keystone XL pipeline. We need to encourage drilling and fracking and the construction of new refineries. We have all the resources here in the United States to be energy independent, and we need to achieve energy independence by going forward, disentangling the foreign policy from our energy policy, and then we also need to go back to those rules and regulations that I just spoke about. The 1990 Clean Air Act one that hasn't been looked at for decades, is the ostensible justification for many of the rules and regulations and mandates that you're seeing coming out of the EPA. For instance, the mercury emissions. The 1990 Clean Air Act never mentioned mercury emissions, but we have the Cohasset Power Plant in Minnesota that spent nearly $380 million to upgrade for mercury emissions. All those costs will be passed along to ratepayers. And yet in 2015, they're going to have to upgrade again to respond to carbon emission standards. This is an agency, the EPA, completely out of control. That's why the answer is to repeal the delegations of authority, put a moratorium on rules and regulations that aren't health and safety required, and start over. That's why we need a stronger U.S. Senate, not a weaker one. I have a third question. Okay.
Third question. How would you propose addressing the illegal immigration problem and, as a result, the national security threat our nation faces as a result of our open borders policies and indiscriminate enforcement of the law?
Thank you. Well, we need to secure our borders. It's not optional. We've actually paid for it. We've authorized the Department of Homeland Security, we've provided for it in the budget, and they've come back with no answers. Another example of the need for the use of the confirmation power. No one from the Department of Homeland Security should be confirmed again until we actually get the plan for operational security at our borders. That's number one. Number two, we actually have lawsuits. The federal government has been sued by our own employees, officers in ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Bureau, because they don't know what their job is. They don't know if they're supposed to enforce our immigration laws or not. Well, I have to tell you, they're all supposed to work for us, including the President of the United States himself, and he needs to follow the rule of law. Because we all know here, all those executive orders, many of them are unconstitutional, outside the scope of his authority. They clearly are unconstitutional to the extent that they contradict our own laws. If they were to implement our laws, or the President were given actual authority to pass regulations or executive orders, that's different. But in this case, he's actually writing executive orders that contradict and undermine our laws. Those executive orders are unlawful, and it's going to take a strong United States Senate to sue if necessary to ensure that the President does not overreach his authority. And so we need to get very serious about this. We need to secure our borders. We need to insist on the enforcement of our current laws before we begin to talk about changing them, because we need to have a trusting relationship with our government and our executive branch again. We have to believe that our laws mean something and that the rule of law will be followed, because tyranny begins when the rule of law ends. Am I right? That's John Locke. Right.
And now, on the flip side, we have some yes or no questions.
Does anyone really answer yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try. I'll try.
Yes. The United Nations advocates unconstitutional programs like Agenda 21, while the approval rating of the UN among the American people has been reported to be less than 30%. Will you support and vote for legislative initiatives that will get the United States out of the UN?
I think it depends on the how. But
Yes.
I am
Yes or no?
I am skeptical of the United Nations. That's the best answer I have. I'm very skeptical, and as I said, we need to use that ratification power in the U.S. Senate to better use. I'm sorry, that's the answer.
It's safe to say it's not a yes?
It's not a yes, it's not a no. It's a much bigger conversation than a yes or no, I'm sorry, from my point of view.
Next yes or no. There is no power granted in the Constitution for federal involvement in education and programs it promulgates, such as Common Core. Will you support and vote for legislation that will abolish the Federal Department of Education?
That is a goal of mine. I don't support Common Core, and I don't believe we need a Department of Education.
So that's a yes?
That's a goal of mine, yes.
Okay, and the last yes or no. Will you support and vote for a full audit of the Federal Reserve System?
You're going to like this one. Yes.
Okay, simple. Like it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.